There was a time when Jesus sent his disciples across the Sea of Galilee in a boat while he spent the night up on a mountain in prayer. But his disciples got caught in this storm, and after struggling all night against the wind and the waves, they found themselves far from land and unable to get where they were supposed to go. Jesus comes to them walking on the water, and in that moment when they see him, they are terrified, but he says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, let me come out. Command me to come out to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter walks on the water until there's this moment when his faith sinks, and he does too. And Jesus and he cries out to Jesus, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reaches out his strong hand and takes hold of his and pulls him up out of the water. And the disciples worship him. It's that moment that we want to focus on today when Peter says, "Lord, save me," because we're in this series, we're calling it accidental prayers, right? And it's the idea that if you go through the Gospels, these stories of the life of Jesus, you find these moments when people show up and they talk to Jesus, and it's really, a lot of times it's like a prayer. And maybe we can grab some of those and have those in our arsenal of prayers that we can call on when we are in a time of need. And here's one that Peter says, "Lord, save me." And you know, this is the thing. It's Peter, right? I mean, Peter who wanted to go to Jesus, Peter, this water walker, but who in the moment sees the enormity of the wind and the waves, and he starts to sink in over his head, and that's when he calls out, "Lord, save me." And I don't know if you're like me. Maybe you've been there, though, in this place where Peter finds himself. Maybe you've been in a place where you sense the wind picking up, and the waves are starting to swell, and you sense there are these dark depths opening below you. Maybe you've been in over your head and you have cried out just like Peter did, "Lord, save me." Maybe that's the main prayer in your life. I don't know. "Lord, save me." And you know, that is a very powerful prayer, because I think a lot of times we find ourselves in these places in life that are windy and wet and dark. We were there last weekend. Like Larry mentioned, we were at the Men and Boys Retreat. Thanks for giving me that day off. And we usually go to Camp Menascot and stay in a nice, solid cabin. They're very simple cabins, but they do the job. They keep the wind and the rain off. But this year, we picked to, for the first time, stay in a tent and use sleeping bags and to be out under under the elements. And so there we are, bundled in our sleeping bags in that tent, and the wind picked up. And the tent started to shake and to blow back and forth, and the rain was coming down and pelting the tent, and lightning was flashing and lighting up the sky, and thunder was rumbling, and I'm laying there in my sleeping bag saying, "Lord, may the lightning not strike our tent, please." And all night long, I'm worried for my little sons that they're going to get cold, and I'm trying to keep them warm in their sleeping bags, and the next morning they're like, "We were hot. Why did you keep covering us up?" But you know what? We did a second night of this. We liked it so much. We spent another night out under the storm. So it was great. We had fun. But you know, here, this place that's dark and cold and windy and wet, "Lord, save me." And here are these disciples in a much more serious place. They'd been feeding the 5,000, and Jesus told them to pack up and to get in a boat and go across the Sea of Galilee. You know, why did he do that? Did he want them to spend some time alone like he was going to spend time alone? I mean, maybe he knew, like in the Gospel of Mark, that at another occasion they had been ministering to people, healing, teaching, feeding them. Maybe Jesus knew that, like in that moment, they were going to need to spend some time alone in a deserted place to kind of recoup. But Jesus must have known that when he packed them into that boat, what he was sending them out into. I mean, many of these disciples, not all, but many of them were fishermen. They knew their business. They'd been out on the water before. You would think just a simple glance at the horizon would have told them that there's a possibility of a storm, that the weather could get rough. But they go because Jesus has sent them. And Jesus spends time recouping on the mountain. It says that he dismissed the crowds, he dismissed the disciples, and he physically removes himself and goes up onto a mountain and spends nearly the entire night in prayer. You know, that fact ought to tell us a little something. Jesus spends the night in prayer. I mean, even the Son of God has to keep coming back to the well. He's got to keep spending time in communion with his Father. And Jesus, notice his ministry, notice his life. He doesn't lead a hectic, caffeinated life, a life where he's just running from one need to the other, one thing to the next. Jesus knows that he can't do anything if he first doesn't do prayer. And he needs prayer more than food. He says at one point, I have bread that you don't know about, and he's talking about prayer. He needs prayer more than entertainment. He needs prayer more than the company of his friends. Jesus needs prayer more than the adulation of the crowds. He sends him away. Looks like a successful ministry, a lot of people. He sends him away so he can spend time in prayer. He needs prayer more than a sense that he is beloved and popular. Jesus needs prayer more than a good night's sleep. And so here he is, he's up on the mountain in prayer, and maybe the disciples are spending a different kind of night in prayer because they're out on the open water. They're confronting the wind and the waves, and I imagine them rowing and praying, and trimming the sails and praying, and hanging on for dear life and praying, and saying, Lord, please don't let this wind break apart the boat. Please don't let us be struck by lightning. Lord, please don't let us die. Maybe they felt a little bit like those sailors in the book of Jonah who, when their boat was captured by the wind and the waves, were calling out to whatever God they could think of. And here I imagine them calling out to their God, saying, help us. They're far from land. The wind is against them. But then we see something, verse 25, if you're following along here. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And we know what it is because we've read this before. It's Jesus walking on the water. It's Jesus acting out this conquest of the power of the sea, walking on the water just as Job says that God can pass over the face of the water in the Old Testament. But these disciples in that early morning hour, surrounded by mist and wind, they don't know what they're seeing. I mean, how could they? They're exhausted. They've been straining against the oars all night long. It's early morning. The fourth watch is somewhere between 3 to 6 in the morning, so there can't be too much light. And through rain and mist, you can kind of imagine this. Through rain and mist, they see something coming towards them. And they're terrified. They look out over that water into the heart of that storm and they say, it's a ghost. Do you believe in ghosts? Seems like these disciples did, or something. The scriptures don't say too much about ghosts, and we know that the scriptures talk about there being more to the world than what is immediately visible to our eyes. There's more than just flesh and blood. There are spirits. And the apostles believed that, but what is a ghost? And in our popular culture, I think ghosts are the spirit of a person who has departed and somehow comes back. And when I look at the scriptures, my understanding is that when we die, we go to face God. And it's then that we will either be welcomed into his eternal courts or we will be released into a place of darkness, separation from God. But that it's not possible for spirits to kind of be free-floating and to wonder about the earth. Our souls go where God wills them. Now, people report ghosts, and sometimes people talk about like hauntings of houses or something like that. And I don't know, it could be that many times those so-called ghosts are actually evil spirits that are masquerading as human spirits. I don't know. But sometimes people have had positive encounters with those who have passed on. And I don't think there's anything in our Christian faith or in the scriptures that would rule out the possibility of God allowing a person to return to earth in spirit form for a short time. But we got to be kind of careful with that because we don't want to make King Saul's mistake and start trying to hold seances with the dead or call up the dead or something like that. But it strikes me that there is more going on out there than we're always aware of. And sometimes maybe we can kind of cautiously have an open mind about some of that. But whatever the case with these disciples, they think they're seeing a ghost. And Jesus' form is dark in the early morning. He is shrouded in mist, and people don't generally walk on the water, so they think of the only thing that comes to mind, a ghost. And they're afraid. And Jesus speaks to them, and he says in verse 27, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, most of the disciples must have been amazed by this. I mean, Jesus says, "Take courage." You'd think they would kind of say, "Oh, good, it's you." But Peter goes a step further. Peter's looking for more. I mean, this is kind of Peter's personality. Peter always wants more of Jesus. And when when Jesus asks the disciples at a different place in the Gospels who they say he is, Peter's the one who says, "I believe you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He goes a little farther. When Jesus says that he must wash their feet if they're to have any part in him, then Peter says, "Not just my feet, but my head and my whole body also." When Jesus says, "One of you will betray me," Peter says, "Not me. Even if I have to die, I will never betray you." I mean, Peter is this kind of all-in guy. This is maybe why Jesus says, "You are Peter, on you I will build my church." I mean, Jesus is the cornerstone and the foundation, but Peter's the building material for the church. And so here when Jesus comes walking over the water and he meets those disciples in the boat and he says, "Do not fear," Peter's ready to take it a step further. Peter says, follow this in verse 28, Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water." And I don't think Peter was trying to test Jesus. He's not trying to make Jesus prove that it's him. I think Peter's expressing his faith. Peter wants to share in Jesus' conquest over the elements, in Jesus' ministry, in Jesus' life. And so he says, "If it's you, call me out onto that water." And Jesus says, "Come." At first things go all right for Peter. He's walking on the water. It's happening. But the storm is not over, and the wind and the waves are battering him, and we all know what happens. So long as Peter keeps his eyes on Jesus, everything is fine. He's moving towards Jesus. He's taking another step towards Jesus, and it's all good. He's okay. But there's this moment when the wind and the waves seem bigger than Jesus. The moment that the challenges he's facing seem greater than anything Jesus can handle. And that's when Peter starts to sink. And his feet slide into the water, and then he's up into his shins, and then his knees slide in, and his waist, until finally he calls out, "Lord, save me." There it is, Peter's accidental prayer, Peter's prayer for salvation. "Lord, save me." Have you ever prayed this? "Lord, save me." Have you ever been in a place where you don't have the wherewithal? Didn't have the wherewithal to get out, where the waves were high, where the wind was stiff and strong, and all you could do is cry out to God, "Lord, save me." Have you ever been sinking down into the dark water? Have you ever experienced the words of Psalm 130 that say, "Out of the depths I cry to you"? It's the prophet Jonah's prayer from the belly of that great fish. "I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me." Lord, save me. This may be the most basic prayer. Lord, save me, when we realize that we're lost in our sins and all the baggage that we carry with us, and that we can only be saved by him. Lord, save me when we're in sickness and trouble and chaos. Lord, save me when we are sinking in up to our ears. Lord, save me in the wind. Lord, save me in the waves. Lord, save me. Have you ever prayed that prayer? Are you saved? And we think about being saved as this one-time thing. This moment of passing from death to life, darkness to light. And it is that. We are saved by the blood of Christ. We are saved by his death on the cross, and we are given new life by his resurrection. Lord, save me. And I pray that all of us can come to a place where we recognize our need for Jesus, are convicted by that, and that we recognize that our life is not going to be full and whole and true if God's not in it. Where we recognize that the wind and the waves are too great for us, and we call out, Lord, save me. But it's much more than that. Because there's going to be a lot of moments in our lives where we're going to realize that we need Jesus. When we realize that there is more coming at us than we can handle. When we realize just how small we are in this great big world. And I think that's when we're going to pray, Lord, save me. Have you ever felt the waves coming over your head and called out to God? I have. There was this time when I went to the beach with a friend. And I waded out into the water, and I dived beneath the waves, and I swam out a bit, and all was fine and well. I considered myself a pretty strong swimmer. Until I tried to get back to shore. And then I realized that I couldn't because the undertow was pulling me out, and I would stroke against the waves, but as far as I would get in, the wave would then immediately pull me back out again, and I could feel the strength of the water tugging on me. And I'd swim a little bit, but it'd pull me back out, and I started to get a little bit tired. And the waves started to come over my head, and I started to have a hard time getting air, and I could feel myself getting worn out there in the ocean. And I could see my friend watching from shore thinking, this doesn't look good. And I remember thinking to myself, you think strange things in these moments. I remember thinking to myself, wow, I hadn't thought I was going to die today. And I suppose no one ever thinks they're going to die today. And suddenly, out of nowhere, there were these lifeguards. I mean, it was an off-season swim. There were no lifeguards on the beach when I went out. Suddenly, there's these lifeguards wading through the rough surf and one hangs onto the hand of another, and the next one reaches out with this human chain, and they toss me their Baywatch orange plastic thingy, and I grab onto that, and they pull me in, and I just breathe on the shore. And even when I was just writing this sermon and thinking about this story, I remembered how I felt when I couldn't swim in, when I felt those waves coming over my head. It made me give thanks for life. It made me take a deep breath. And Peter must have felt a little bit like that deep breath when he got out. But he was sinking down. The waves were coming over his head. The wind was strong. The darkness is opening up beneath him. And he says, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out and takes hold of him in his strong hand. Where do you need that? Where are you struggling? Where are the waves overwhelming you? Where do you need Jesus to just reach into your life and take hold of you with his strong hand and pull you out? Where do you need to pray, Lord, save me? And honestly, I think that so often we need saving from so much. But I think so often what we really need saving from is ourselves. I mean, we need saving from our twisted up attitudes, our own self-righteousness, our anger, our own lack of perspective. I think so many times what we need saving from isn't something external, but something internal. We need saving from ourselves. And you kind of see it here in this story. Right? Peter walks on the water for a moment, and then he sinks. And Peter, when he calls out, he says, Lord, save me. And Jesus saves him. And look what Jesus says to him in verse 31. They get into the boat, and Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Right? I mean, Jesus does not say, those were big waves, Peter. He does not give Peter some technical tips for how to wave walk better next time. It is not about the externals. Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? So Jesus right away focuses on Peter's heart, and he says, where was your faith? He says, why did you doubt? He doesn't talk about the waves at all. He talks about the heart, and Peter saw external problems. Peter thought he had a wind and a waves problem. But Jesus focuses on the heart situation. Jesus identifies a heart problem. It was a problem in how Peter was looking at things. And I don't think that everything is what you make of it. I mean, there are things in life that are big and bad and just out of our control. But I do think that a lot of times we have a tendency to focus on the externals and not recognize the internal struggle. Right? We look at the external things. We think that's the problem. It's, if I just had a little more money, then it'd be all right. Or if I just had a little more time, then I could do these things that would be important to me. Or if people would just listen to me, or if I would have just made a different decision. We look at these external things. But a lot of times, external things are not the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is many times our hearts. It's what's in here, not what's out there. And you see, it's easy to blame the wind and the waves. Everybody blames the wind and the waves. But a lot of times it's really an attitude problem or a trust problem or a love problem or a faith problem. And a lot of times it's easier to focus on the externals because that keeps us from having to look at our hearts. Lord, that wind and those waves are just keeping me from really following you. If you just would deal with that. But Jesus cuts right through the externalization. Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" We see this in the Old Testament. Someone who focused on the externals when really it was an internal problem he needed to deal with. And I think about King Saul in the Old Testament. King Saul, right? He had a lot of good qualities, got himself in trouble. He mustered this army of Israel, and they're going to go fight with the Philistines, right? And he gets them together, and the Philistines have been oppressing them. And Saul brings together the armies of Israel from the 12 tribes, and they cross over the river Jordan to take on the Philistines. And it says in the scriptures that there are just thousands upon thousands of chariots and war-making materials, and men gathered among the Philistines like the sand of the seashore. And here's Saul with his hardy band of Israelite warriors. And he says, all right, we're going to fight the Philistines. All we need is one thing, and that is the sacrifice to God before the battle begins. All we need is Samuel, the prophet priest, to come and offer the sacrifice. Let's wait. Philistines over here, thousands upon thousands. Israelites over here, a couple hundred, looking at each other. Let's wait for Samuel. And Saul is waiting for 1 day, nothing. Saul's waiting for 2 days, nothing. A whole week passes, no Samuel. And it's like, we've got to get this show on the road, and the people start to wander away. They think Saul's not a great leader, so Saul takes matters into his own hands, and he says, bring me the animals for the sacrifice. I will do this myself. And he sacrifices the animals, and no sooner has he done that, offered the sacrifice to God, than Samuel shows up and says, what have you done? It is not yours. You're a king, not a priest. It's not your job to offer the sacrifice to God. You're going to lose the kingdom. So here's this moment where Saul is focused on this external problem. He thinks he's got a military problem. He thinks he's got a timing problem. He thinks he's got a morale problem. But what Saul actually has in that moment is a faith problem. It's faith in God's timing through his priest Samuel, and Saul doesn't have it in that moment. So I think we see this. We see moments where people, where all of us do this, where we think it's about something external, but it's really something internal that we've got to deal with. And Jesus saves us, but so often it's not just the external stuff that Jesus saves us from, but it's the internal. It's the struggle that's going on in our hearts. It's the struggle of faith. And I think a lot of times Jesus has got to save us from ourselves. But don't get the idea that it's just a matter of doing the will of God so that everything will go our way. When you look at this story, Jesus told the disciples to go out in that boat, and he sent them straight into a storm, and they obeyed. And Jesus told Peter to step out onto the water, and he obeyed. And so Peter is doubly doing the will of God, both being out on the boat and walking on the water, and still Peter sinks. It is from within Peter's obedience to the will of God that he finds himself crying out, Lord, save me. We may be doing the right thing, but that's no guarantee that it's going to be easy. We may be doing the will of God, but still we may need to cry out for help. Lord, save me. I mean, that is where Peter was. He was in the will of God. He was doing the Lord's work. He was following the voice of Jesus, but he's still crying out, Lord, save me. And even when we feel like we're doing God's will, there are going to be hard things. There are going to be struggles. There are going to be obstacles. There's going to be wind and waves. We've got to find a way. We just keep calling out to Jesus. Think about Nehemiah in the Old Testament. We're going to do a series on Nehemiah in the fall when I get back from sabbatical, but I think about Nehemiah. You know, Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem, tries to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and he faces this opposition from without and this opposition from within. And at some point, Nehemiah prays this great prayer. I kind of love this prayer. He says, "Remember for my good, O my God, all I have done for this people." It's Nehemiah 5:19. Remember, oh my God, all I've done for this people. I mean, this is kind of throw your hands up in the prayer, in the air prayer, right? Like, don't forget everything I've done for these people, God. And you know, back in the gospel, after Peter and Jesus returned to the boat, the storm stops, and all the disciples worship Jesus, and they say, "Truly you are the Son of God." And this is the thing. All prayer resolves into worship. All prayer leads us beyond asking for things to an encounter with the living God who comes to be with us, who calls us to be with him. If you trace the arc of prayer all the way up, it will always find its purpose and meaning in worship. And that's because prayer is never about problems. Prayer is never about the wind. Prayer is not about the waves. Prayer is about the one who walks over the water, who reaches out his strong hand, and in his mercy saves us. Lord, save us. I think that's our prayer. Thanks be to God. Amen.